Good day, everyone. I'm going to discuss the social basis of language from our book, The Psychology of Language. So let's start. We noted earlier that it is difficult to disentangle the specific effects of linguistic deprivation in feral children from the effects of other factors, such as malnutrition and emotional and social deprivation. Cases such as that of Jane, the hearing child of deaf parents, point to the importance of exposure to language in a socially meaningful situation. It is clearly not enough to be exposed to language. Something more is necessary. Adults tend to talk to children about objects that are in view and about events that have just happened, the here and now. The usefulness of this is obvious. For example, in associating names with objects, and it is clear that learning language just by watching television is going to be very limited in this respect. To be effective, early language learning must take place in a social setting. Social interactionists stress the importance of the development of language through interaction with other people. According to social interactionists, although biological and cognitive processes may be necessary for language development, they are not sufficient. Language development must occur in the context of meaningful social interaction. Brunner stressed the importance of the social setting in acquiring language. In many respects, his views are similar to those of Piaget, but he places more emphasis on social development than on cognitive development. Brunner stressed the importance of the social setting of the mother-child dyad in helping children to work out the meaning of utterances to which they are exposed. Although child-directed speech is an important mechanism, the social dyad achieves much more than a particular way of talking. For example, the important distinction between agents who are performing actions and objects who are having actions carried out on them is first made clear in turn-taking. Now, turn-taking is rather like a conversation. Participants appear to take it in turns to do things, although obviously the conscious intent on the part of the infant in this may be limited. Processes such as mutual gaze, when the adult and child look at the same thing, may be important in enabling the child to discover the reference of words. Brunner suggested that some of these social skills, or the way in which they are used in learning language, may be innate. Establishing joint attention is another important social device. Brunner described language development as taking place within the context of LASS, or language acquisition socialization system. Other aspects of the social setting are important for linguistic development. Feedback from adults about children's communicative efficiency plays a vital role in development. Now, in summary, the development of communicative competence is an essential prerequisite of language acquisition. Let's go to turn-taking in early conversation. There is more learning to use language than just learning the meanings of words and grammar. Conversations have a structure. Clearly, we do not always talk all at once. We appear to take turns in conversation. At the very least, children have to learn to listen and to pay some attention when they are spoken to. Now, how does this ability to interact in conversational settings develop? There is some evidence that it appears at a very early age. Skyfer, 1975, proposed that the origins of turn-taking lie in feeding. In feeding, sucking occurs in bursts interspersed with pauses that appear to act as a signal to mothers to play with the baby, to cuddle it, or to talk to it. He also noted that mothers and babies rarely vocalize simultaneously. For Snow, He observed that mothers respond to their babies' vocalizations as if their yawns and burps were appearances. Hence, the precursors of conversation are present at an early age and might emerge from other activities. The gaze of mother and child also seem to be correlated. In particular, the mother quickly turns her gaze to whatever the baby is looking at. Hence again, cooperation emerges at an early age. Although in these cases, it is the mother who is apparently sensitive to the poses of the child. There is further evidence that babies of just a few weeks old are differentially sensitive to features of their environment. Now, according to Trevor Then, 1975, he found that babies visually track and try to grab inanimate objects, but they make other responses to people, including waving and what he called free speech. Now, free speech is a small movements of the mouth, rather like a precursor of talking. The exact role of this free speech isn't clear, but certainly by the end of the first 6 months, the precursors of social and conversational skills are apparent, and infants have developed the ability to elicit communicative responses. Disorders of the social use of language. Finally, it is clear that there are developmental disorders associated with using language in a social context. Bishop, 1997, describes semantic pragmatic disorder. This is a subtype of specific language impairment that looks like it is a very mild version of autism. Children with semantic pragmatic disorder often have difficulty in conversations where they have to draw interferences. They give very literal answers to questions, failing to take the preceding conversational and social context into account, um, as in the following. Example, the adult asks the child, "Can you tell me about your party?" And then the child just answer yes. Although semantic pragmatic disorder is poorly understood, it is clear that its origins are complex, whereas related disorders might be explicable in terms of memory limitations or social neglect. Semantic pragmatic disorder is probably best explained in terms of these children having difficulty in representing other people's mental states. This, in turn, is probably due to an innate or developmental brain abnormality. Once again, this deficit illustrates how difficult it can be to disentangle biological, cognitive, and social factors from each other. Now, what is the relation between language and thought? Here we examine the relation between language and other cognitive and biological processes. Does the form of our language influence or determine the way in which we think, or is the form of our language dependent on more general cognitive factors? Many animals are clearly able to solve some problems without language, but the extent to which language fusion in apes improves performance on other cognitive tasks is controversial. This observation suggests that language cannot be essential for problem solving and thought. Although this may seem obvious, it has not always been considered so. Among the early approaches to examining the relation between language and thought, the behaviorists believed that thought was nothing more than speech. Young children speak their thoughts aloud. This becomes internalized, with the result that thought is covered speech. Thought is nothing more than small motor movements of the vocal apparatus. Watson argued that thought processes are nothing more than motor habits in the larynx. Jacobsen found some evidence for this belief because thinking often is accompanied by covered speech. He detected electrical activity in the throat muscles when participants were asked to think. But is thought possible without these small motor movements? Now, Smith, Brown, Thomas, and Goodman, sorry, used Curare to paralyze temporarily all the voluntary muscles of a volunteer. Smith, who clearly deserved to be first author on this paper, despite being unable to make any motor movement of the speech apparatus, Smith later reported that he had been able to think and solve problems. Hence, there is more to thought than moving the vocal apparatus. Perhaps language further sets us apart from animal because it enables new and more advanced forms of thought. We can list the logically possible alternatives. Each of them has been championed at some time or other. First, cognitive development determines language development. This is the viewpoint adopted by Piaget and his followers. Second, language and cognition are independent faculties, according to Chomsky's position. Third, language and cognition originate independently but become interdependent. The relation is complex. This is according to Vygotsky's position. And finally, the fourth one, the idea that language determines cognition is known as the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, the interdependence of language and thought by Vygotsky. The Russian psychologist Vygotsky argued for a complex relation between language and thought based on his observations of inner speech, egocentric speech, and child monologues. He proposed that speech and thought have different ontogenetic roots, that is, different origins within an individual. Early on, in particular, speech has pre-intellectual stage. In this stage, words are not symbols for the objects they denote, but are actual properties of the objects. Speech sounds are not attached to thought. At the same time, early thought is non-verbal, so up to some point in development, when the child is about 3 years of age, speech and thought are independent. After this, they become connected, and at this point, speech and thought become interdependent. Thought becomes verbal, and speech becomes representational. When this happens, children's monologues are internalized to become inner speech. Vygotsky contrasted his theory with that of Piaget, using experiments that manipulated the strength of social constraints. Unlike Piaget, Vygotsky considered that later cognitive development was determined in part by language. Piaget argued that egocentric speech arises because the child does not yet become fully socialized and withers away, as the child learns to communicate by taking into account the point of view of the listener. For Vygotsky, the reverse was the case. Egocentric speech serves the function of self-guidance that eventually becomes internalized as inner speech and is only vocalized because the child has not yet learned to internalize it. The boundaries between child and listener are confused, so that self-guiding speech can only be produced in a social context. Vygotsky found that the amount of egocentric speech decreased when the child's feeling of being understood lessened, such as when the listener was at another table. He claimed that this was the reverse of what Piaget would predict. However, these experiments are difficult to evaluate because Vygotsky omitted many procedural details and measurements from his reports that are necessary for a full evaluation. It is surprising that the studies have not been repeated under more stringent conditions. Until then, and until this type of theory is more fully specified, it is difficult to evaluate the significance of Vygotsky's ideas. Next is the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, the central idea of the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis is that the form of our language determines the structure of our thought processes. Language affects the way we remember things and the way in which we perceive the world. It was originally proposed by a linguist, Edward Saphir, and a fire insurance engineer and amateur linguist, Benjamin Lee Work. The Saphir-Whorf hypothesis comprises two related ideas. First, linguistic determinism is the idea that the form and characteristics of our language determine the way in which we think, remember, and perceive. Second, linguistic relativism is the idea that as different languages map onto the world in different ways, different languages will generate different cognitive structures. We'll go to anthropological evidence. The anthropological evidence concerns the intertranslatability of languages. Work analyzed Native American Indian languages such as Hopi, Nootka, Apache, and Aztec. He argued that each language imposes its own worldview on its speakers. For example, he concluded that as Hopi contains no words or grammatical constructions that refer to time, Hopi speakers must have a different conception of time from us. Works data are now considered highly unreliable. Furthermore, translations can be very misleading. Take as an example Work's analysis of clear dripping spring in the following quote. We might isolate something in nature by saying it is a dripping spring. Apache Rex the statements on a verb GA, be white, including clear, uncolored, and so on. With the prefix no, the meaning of downward motion enters. Whiteness moves downward, then to meaning both water and spring is prefixed. The result corresponds to a dripping spring, but synthetically, it is a water or spring. Whiteness moves downward. How utterly unlike our way of thinking. In fact, Worf's translation was very idiosyncratic. Even so, it is far from clear that speakers of Apache actually dissect the world in different ways. For example, both languages have the separate elements for clear, spring, and moving downwards. And why should the expression not have been translated? It is a clear dripping spring. The appeal of such translations is further diminished when it is realized that Worth based his claim not on interviews with Apache speakers, but on an analysis of their recorded grammar. Now, Lennerberg and Roberts pointed out the circularity in the reasoning that because language differ, thought patterns differ because of difference in the languages. An independent measure of thought patterns is necessary before a factual conclusion can be drawn. Vocabulary differentiation has been used to support the Worthian hypothesis. This is the idea that cultures must view the world differently because some cultures have single words available for concepts that others may take many words to describe. For example, Boas reported that Eskimo or Inuit debunking of some of these claims can be found in volume. Inuit language has 4 different words for snow, and there are 13 Filipino words for rice. An amusing debunking of some of these claims can be found in volume. Worth inflated the number of words for snow to 7 and drew a comparison with English, which he said has only 1 word for snow, regardless of whether it is falling on the ground, slushy, dry, or wet, and so on. The number of types of snow the Inuit was supposed to have then varied with the subsequent indirect reporting, apparently reaching its maximum in an editorial in the New York Times on February 9, 1984, with 100 to 200 in a Cleveland television weather forecast. In fact, it isn't clear how many words Inuit has for snow, but it is certainly not that many. It probably only has two words or roots for types of snow: kanik, Qanik, for snow in the air or snowflake, and aput, Aput, for snow on the ground. It is unclear whether you should count the words derived from these roots as separate. This story reinforces the importance of knowing how you define a word and also of always checking sources. Note that speakers of English actually have several words for different types of snow, including slush, sleet, and blizzard. Vocabulary differences are unlikely to have any significant any significant effect on perception. Although again, it is important to bear in mind what perception might cover here. We can learn new words for snow. People learning to ski readily do so, and while this does not apparently change the quality of the skier's perception of the world, it certainly changes the way in which they classify snow types and respond to them. For example, they might choose not to go skiing on a certain types of snow. Vocabulary differences reflect differences in experience and expertise. They do not seem to cause significant differences in perception, but do aid classification. We now go to grammatical differences between languages. The Saphir-Whorf hypothesis states that differences in languages between cultures will lead to their speakers perceiving the world in different ways and having different cognitive structures. The most important sources of evidence in evaluating the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis are studies of color naming. Now, color naming and memory studies show that although biological factors play the most important role in dividing up the color spectrum, there is some linguistic influence on memory for colors. We now go to evaluation of the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, in recent years, in fact, the weak version of the Saphir-Whorf hypothesis has enjoyed something of a resurgence. There is now a considerable amount of evidence suggesting that linguistic factors can affect cognitive processes. Even color perception and memory, once thought to be completely biologically determined, show some influence of language. Furthermore, recent research on perception and categorization has shown that high-level cognitive processes can influence the creation of low-level visual features early in visual processing. This is entirely consistent with the idea that, in at least some circumstances, language might be able to influence perception. Indeed, it is hardly surprising that if a thought expressible in one language cannot be expressed so easily in another, then that difference will have consequences for the ease with which cognitive processes can be acquired and carried out. Having one word for a concept instead of having to use a whole sentence might reduce memory load. The differences in number systems between languages form one example of how linguistic differences can lead to slight differences in cognitive style. Now, language use and social practices, the last part of my report, is there is evidence that language can affect performance on some perceptual memory and conceptual tasks. That's all. Thank you.